Good evening, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to Tuesday, January 29th, 2024 meeting of the Arroyo Grande City Council. Can we get a roll call, please?
Councilmember Seacrest.
Here.
Councilmember George.
Here.
Councilmember Barnage.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Guthrie.
Here.
Mayor Bay Russum.
Here. Would you please silently join me in a moment of reflection? Thank you. And would you please join me in the flag salute? Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You know what the best part of the flag salute is we all start off slightly differently, and then by about halfway through, we're all on track and unified. It's just like a pledge is supposed to do. All right, that takes us to item 5. This is agenda review tonight. Let's first see if anybody has any reason to reorder anything. Okay, then we'll proceed as published. For 5A, we have no closed session announcements. And for 5B, I will move that all ordinance presented at the meeting shall be read in title only and all further readings be waived.
Second.
We have motion second. Can we get a voice vote, please? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? And motion carries 5-0. That takes us right into special presentations, and we have a very special presentation this evening, perhaps the specialist. And so I am pleased to turn this over to Mr. Robeson for the introduction of our new employee and the oath of office.
Thank you, Mayor, City Council. I'm Bill Robeson. I'm the Assistant City Manager and Public Works Director. And I don't think I've used the word excited as many times over the past few days, but I think I speak for all of our organization in the fact that we are very excited to have Matt Downing appointed by your council as our new city manager. We have he has about 1 or 2 days under his belt now, and we can already feel the fit is there, the technical intelligence is there. And just the overall comfort level that we all look for when we have a leader coming on board. So thank you to the council for your rigorous process of searching and appointing. Thank you for letting staff be a part of that. And we just want to join the council in welcoming Matt and looking forward to a really bright future for the city.
Outstanding. So why don't we administer the oath?
Okay, get your cameras ready.
We'll let Director Valentine get into place.
Repeat after me. Raise your right hand. I state your name.
I, Matthew Downing,
Do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
that I will well and faithfully discharge
that I will well and faithfully discharge
the duties upon which I am about to enter.
the duties upon which I am about to enter. Do you all be bothered if I ask you to come down?
Not at all.
Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. Just keep smiling. Okay, do you want your family? Okay. I
Let's
think
get
if you all
seated,
could
so we'll-
stand, do you want them to stand behind you? Okay. The council could stand. Right? I like that. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Great. And then one more. You wanted the director's
I would love if the department head would want to look
Wait, this is my better side.
Let me go. Get ready. Get closer. Okay, here we go. Say some cheese. One more. One more. There you go.
Matt, as is customary, we usually invite a newly sworn person to say a few words. I don't know if you were prepared for that.
And I'll do it from over here, too. Well, good evening, Mayor, members of council. I'm Matt Downing, and I am now your city manager. First, I wanted to say, again, what an honor it is to be back at the city after some time in our one of our neighboring jurisdictions. I'm incredibly humbled at the opportunity and the council's trust in me in leading this organization. The city is doing so many great things and has so many dedicated and talented professionals and in your staff, and it's incredibly exciting to be back with an organization that means so much to me personally. The coming months I know will be very busy, but I do look forward to seeing a lot of familiar faces out in the community. I've seen some already this evening. And so while I do thank the council for this opportunity, I do want to thank my family for their support. My mom, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, my brother and sister and their families, but most importantly, my wife Megan and my kids, Jackson and Evangeline, pardon me.
It's good. It's all right.
I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you and your love and support, so thank you. So thank you to them and thank you to the council for this opportunity. And I'm going to go sit down now.
We said a lot last time when we made our decision, but I just will reiterate only 2 words of what I previously said, which is welcome home. Would anyone else like to add? Okay. Then we will move on to, you know what, let's just go ahead and open up public comment just in case anybody had anything to say. But this is on items on tonight's agenda. Come on up.
Patty Welsh, Arroyo Grande. Matt, congratulations. Thanks for not taking it personal last time I was here, like I said. I hope you outlast the last 3 city managers, and I hope you don't leave because of the reasons of 2 of them. Congratulations. I liked working with you before. I look forward to it again. Congratulations.
Would anyone else like to speak? And let's check in online and see if there's anybody there who'd like to say a few words.
If any members of the public on Zoom would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. There are no raised hands.
All right, so we'll close public comment. We'll move on to item 6B, City Manager Communications. Mr. Downing.
All right, well, let's try this out. Thank you very much, Mayor, members of the City Council. Matt Downing, City Manager. As I was preparing those comments a little bit ago, the entire time I kept telling myself, don't cry when you get to your family, don't cry when you get to your family, and I'm pretty sure I jinxed it. But anyway, in terms of City Manager Communications this evening, I do have some. On the Legislative and Information Services side, we do have a community survey that's now available on the city's website at www.arroyogrande.org. And it will also be in mailboxes in the coming weeks, and the city does invite community members to complete the survey as part of our ongoing commitment to both listen and to learn from our residents. And we do really encourage you folks to take a minute to complete the survey so that your voice can be heard and be part of our future discussions. Over in community development, we are excited that our new building technician, Emmy, has started yesterday. She and I now have the same start date, so that's exciting. She's our in-house member of the Building Services Division and will process building permit applications, coordinate plan check routing, provide administrative services to the building official, those types of great services. So we're very excited that she's on board. Over in the police department, I do want to share that we have police trainee Madison Johnson, who started the academy yesterday. And so for the next 22 weeks, trainee Johnson will undergo a series of 51 learning domains, leading to her becoming a graduate of the police academy. So we're very excited about that and happy to support her in that journey. And then last, street work here in the village. We have confirmed with the project manager and the foreman that the remaining night work in the village is scheduled for next Sunday night, which is the 7th, so that was last Sunday night, through Friday morning, the 12th. That's this coming Friday. Some additional jackhammering will occur on Thursday and Friday, but that's during the day, and that's to replace the cold patch adjacent to the crosswalk concrete bands. And then lastly, the intersection at Branch and Mason is currently on a timer versus our traditional loops, so I know I've been caught in that in my first 2 days here. And that's because of the crosswalk construction. So we are working to have that done by the end of the week and have those loops replaced and that back on normal schedule. So with that, I will conclude city manager comments. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Let's see if there's any questions from the council. All right, and what's that?
So the night work that will be done on Friday, that's really the end of it. As long as they get that done, it's not, that's the end of the,
I'm going to defer that to Mr. Robeson.
okay,
Yeah, thank you. Yes, that's correct.
okay.
So that is anticipated to be our last night of work. We did have some delays because of the weather. That pushed things off, always does when you're doing construction. But yes, our city engineer and I have been working with the contractor very closely to minimize and to meet the deadlines that we have set with the council. So
Okay.
yes, thank you.
Thank you. And then when that's done, there's no more, is that the end of the work, or is there just some kind of mop-up work here and there
That's a
that's
great
not
question.
jackhammering?
There will be no more night work.
Okay,
There'll be some more work down on Bridge Street during the day. There's some tile bands that need to be removed. But once again, it'll be done during the day, so people won't be impacted in the evening and the nighttime.
okay, thank you, I appreciate that.
And what's the true final date? Like, we're done with the whole thing?
That's a good question, too. The whole thing, meaning everything in the village. We have everything kind of connected with our contractor who's doing sidewalk work, asphalt work, and then work in the village. So
Yes, the village work.
we're anticipating, to be done probably in about the 30th, January 30th. Yeah.
There was a voice
So
from the heavens over there.
that answer was given to me by our city engineer, so I'm thankful she's here to give me that. But yeah, that's the anticipated date of the end of work with J.J. Fisher, who's our contractor, and the end of the project, yes.
Great. All right, let's go ahead and see if the public has any questions or comments. So, being clear, I'm opening public comment. And seeing no one, we'll check online.
If any members of the public on Zoom would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. And there are no raised hands.
All right, so we'll close public comment. Item 7, City Council reports, is not on this rotation. That will be at the next meeting. Community comments and suggestions. This is your chance to come speak to the council on items that are not on tonight's agenda. So if you would like to speak, please come forward. Keep your comments to 3 minutes or less, and please address the council as one body. Would anyone like to comment on items not on tonight's agenda?
Hi, excuse me, Patty Welsh again. I'd like to comment. I went to the workshop that you guys held about road, sidewalks, and accessibility for those of us who walk or ride scooters or are in wheelchairs, etc. One of my suggestions I brought up years ago to Steve Adams, I'd like to bring it up again, and that is it would help the handicapped so much if we would get our waste cans, recyclables, and green waste and have those put in the street with the wheels back against the curb so that when the guys come and put them back, they're not putting them willy-nilly all over the sidewalk, where if you're in a wheelchair, you cannot get down the sidewalk. It's something that's simple to do. It costs the city no money, and it helps out people who are less fortunate than I am. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? He's seeing no one in chambers. Let's check online.
If any members of the public on Zoom would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. Okay, there are no raised hands.
All right, we'll close public comment. This takes us to item 9. This is our consent agenda, and collectively tonight, this is items 9A through 9G. So I'll check in with council and see if anybody has something to make a question or poll for separate consideration. Anybody? Okay, I just have a quick question about 9F. And I didn't ask it ahead of time because I figure it's intuitive, but I just want to make sure I'm right. 9F is regarding the Swinging Bridge retrofit project, which came in, I would not say under budget, but under the budgeted amount. But what it didn't say was how the pots of money were going to be used. So my assumption is that the money from the feds, the $500,000 goes first, then the ARPA funds second, and then whatever else is left over is sales tax funds. But it didn't say that.
That is the sequence that we'll be spending the money,
Okay.
yes.
All right.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Great. All right, so let's go ahead and open up public comment on the consent agenda. Again, this is items 9A through 9G. Would anyone like to speak on these items?
Patty Welsh again. 9G. I was here when you guys made the decision. I thought it was that each homeowner was getting $5,000. So excuse me, because I read now it's up to $5,000. But some of my issues with that were that you put no restrictions on the waiver. So I don't know if some of those houses were rentals versus homeowner occupied. I think that would make a difference. Also, if they're going to go in and build a bigger house, why are they getting a waiver on that? The houses were built below grade. They knew where they were when they purchased them. You guys said there was no grandfathering in after you do this, so that there's no promise in the future. But you expect things to get worse because of climate change. It just seems, the perception of it seems off-sided to me. And one of the reasons is the city keeps raising the cost for permits and fees to help recoup the cost. And then you're willing to give away up to $4,000 in permits and fees. And you base that on what San Luis Obispo was giving in fees. And we're not San Luis Obispo. We don't have that kind of income here. And so I would have just liked to have seen some conditions or something put on there, or thought through a little bit more, so that when the next disaster happens, people know kind of what to expect from the city and if the city is going to be there at all for us. So thank you.
Anyone else on the consent agenda? All right, let's check in with the city clerk.
If any members of the public on Zoom would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. And there are no raised hands.
Thank you. So we'll close public comment. And Bill, I'll kind of come back to you on this one. There was questions and comments there, but I think it's safest to just kind of talk about, we did put restrictions and conditions on this. Can you speak to that, or perhaps you or Isaac speak to what we did and whether or not, how that applies to a bigger house, bigger, I'll say in quotation marks, and what that means for the next disaster?
Well, the $5,000 is up to, so we would not be giving anyone that was affected by this last storm event, and that everything is relegated to the last storm event. We would not be giving them more than $5,000. We have looked through the neighborhood. There's about a maximum of 3 homes that would be rebuilt, so Again, we're anticipating the $5,000 to be potentially given to those 3 residential homeowners. I think there was a question about rental versus a owner. In the case of a damaged home, the owner would have to come through and get the permits, consent of landowners so that we can go on the property and do inspections, et cetera. So that money would be going to the property owners so that they could improve the home. If it's a rebuild of the house, because I know that there was a question about rebuilding in the flood area, the house needs to be built with the finished floor above 2 feet above the flood inundation line. So there are codes that we look at. There are analysis that are done by a civil engineer that we look at to make sure that the new home would not be flooded like we're experiencing or they experienced in the last flood. I'm not sure if that answers all the questions, but I think it highlights most of them.
It does. And Isaac, can I ask you to just comment on what that means going forward?
Sure,
'Cause we
Mayor.
were very, very careful with this.
Correct. So it's quite a limited fee waiver in scope. As Bill mentioned, there's only a handful of homes that are eligible because council's direction that's codified by this formal action is only those homes that were red tagged or yellow tagged as a result of the 2023 storm events that occurred when the city had a declared local emergency. So it is limited in scope. And just to further piggyback off what Mr. Robeson said regarding home ownership, there are conditions within the resolution that require that the person who comes in provide evidence that they own the home, as is the city's direction with respect to size. And additionally, at council's request, there is an obligation that the permits, the fee waiver can be submitted within 90 days, but the permits would need to be pulled within a year. So CDD is looking at council's former direction, which is within this item, and making a determination to ensure it's within that limited scope discussed.
And wasn't there a provision about showing that federal and other funds weren't sufficient?
Correct, and also a required waiver from the homeowner to ensure that the city can only speak for its own set of reduced fees and wasn't making representations and isn't responsible for federal dollars, but it is to provide evidence to the city that they're eligible for the city's fee waiver up to $5,000.
Thank you. Okay, so let's bring this back around to the council for discussion and or possible action.
Madam Mayor, I would move for approval of items 9A through 9G.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Can we get a roll call, please?
Councilmember Barnage?
Yes.
Councilmember George?
Yes.
Councilmember Seacrest?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Guthrie?
Yes.
Mayor Ray Russum?
Yes. Item 10A this is our public hearing item tonight. This is a consideration of a resolution for installation of one domestic well on property zoned planned development. And the applicant is Michael Harris. The representative is Richard Bird from Slow Civil Design. And Mr. Pedrati, you have an announcement for us.
Yes, thank you. Brian Pedrati, Community Development Director. The applicant has requested that this item be continued to a date certain of February 27th, 2024. And so we have received correspondence to that. So staff recommendation is to go ahead and continue it to that date.
All right, great, thank you. And because this is a publicly noticed hearing, I'm going to go ahead and open up public comment. So would anyone like to comment on item 10A? And seeing no one here, we'll check in online.
If any members on Zoom would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. There are no raised hands.
And Mayor, my recommendation while the public hearing is open is that the council actually take a vote to consider continuing that open public hearing to the 27th.
Got it. All right, so let us consider that. Would anyone like to make that motion?
I'll move. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'll move we delay this item until the February 27th meeting.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Can we get a roll call, please?
Mayor Pro Tem Guthrie?
Yes.
Councilmember George?
Yes.
Councilmember Barnage?
Yes.
Councilmember Seacrest?
Yes.
Mayor Ray Russum?
Yes. Item 11, old business, we have none. Item 12, new business, we are at 12A already. This is the consideration of results of the voter opinion polling for a potential future ballot measure. And it says Robeson Matson, so I don't know who I'm turning this over to.
It's me.
All right.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. The item before you is a presentation of voter opinion polling results for a potential future sales tax measure. The presentation has a limited scope this evening, and Dr. Tim McLarney with True North Research will present the polling results. Council is not providing direction on specific language tonight. Rather, staff's recommendation is to receive the presentation regarding polling results and direct staff to continue working with the city's consultant on outreach and education. The calling of the November 2024 general municipal election and any ballot measure recommendations will come back to council for consideration later this spring with specific procedural requirements that were not noticed for this evening. So with that, I'd like to introduce the city's voter opinion polling consultant, Dr. McLarney, with True North Research, and he is here virtually. All right, Tim. Let's see. See if we can see you here. There he is. Oh. Tim, we can't hear you. No, we still can't hear you. Give us one moment and I'll check in with our operators.
Hey Tim, this is Travis from AGP Video. We had you earlier. Have you changed any settings since then? Would you mind disconnecting and reconnecting?
How's that?
Yes, we hear you now.
Okay, great. Well, Mayor's members, Council, McLarney, I'm the North Research, and we are a firm that over the last 20 years has specialized in working with cities in using surveys to help them develop a statistically reliable understanding of the communities and the customers that they serve. To date, my business partner and I have worked on over 1,300 research studies for public agencies, and about half of the studies that we're doing these days is what you call revenue measure feasibility studies. Similar to what we're going to be talking about here tonight, where the goal is to understand if it's feasible to move forward with some type of revenue measure, and if it is feasible, to understand how might you go about structuring that measure in a way that it's consistent with the type of measure your community is supporting. To date, we've helped our clients have a lot of success in this area. We've worked on research that has led to over 35 billion in voter-approved measures around the state. Our overall success rate is about 95% for measures that we recommend go to ballot. And I mention this because as we get into tonight's presentation, or perhaps in response to council's questions, I might make mention of how the results we're seeing in Arroyo Grande line up against types of results that we're seeing in other cities that are considering these tax measures, and I just want you to have a sense for the experience base from which I would be speaking. And I apologize, I may halt a little bit here and there. I'm getting a ton of feedback through my headset, and so I'm having to listen to myself on delay about 2 seconds. So if I seem a little awkward, it's probably because I'm listening to myself.
Also, the public's having issues hearing this at home?
So Tim, I'm going to suggest that you disconnect from this and then connect via the Zoom link, and we'll hear you audio only, and we'll control the presentation here in the chamber.
Okay, which one would be the Zoom link? I apologize.
I will email it to you right now.
Okay.
Apologies all. We'll get this figured out. Good news is we have a system upgrade coming, so that should help. Okay. It's scheduled for in February, so really soon. Just that easy, yeah. There's Tim. Okay.
Okay. How's that? A little better?
Yes, much better. Okay, I will get your presentation up here.
Great. Okay. So would you like me to repeat my introduction, or are you good with that and I can move on to slide 2?
You can go ahead and move on, Tim.
Okay, great. So if we can go to the next slide here. So before we get into the actual results of the survey, it's helpful to take a moment to review the purpose of the study, or why we go about doing this type of research, as well as the methodology, or how we went about conducting the study. In terms of the purpose, I see these types of studies as really trying to address the 3 bullets you see here on the slide. The first is answer that basic question of, is it feasible? And what I mean by that is, if you as a council were to choose to move forward with a ballot measure for November related to a potential sales tax measure, does that measure have a reasonable chance of success? The answer to that question isn't always yes. Sometimes we do this research, and no matter how we look at the data, there's really no clear path to get you from where you are today to where you need to be viable on election day. And if that's the case, I'll be the first person to tell you that. When we do find that there's a feasible path forward, that second bullet kicks in gear, which is to understand how might you go about structuring a measure so that it's consistent with the type of measure that your community is interested in supporting. There's a lot of components to a revenue measure package. There's how you'd propose to spend the money, what the tax rate is, obviously what election date it's going to be on, what sort of accountability provisions would be built into this measure. There's questions about duration, et cetera. So there's a lot of sort of questions that ultimately need to be answered before you can place a measure on the ballot, and the survey can help guide that. And then finally, the survey is an opportunity to understand sort of the role of information in shaping voters' opinions about your proposal. I'm a big proponent that if a public agency is going to take the step of putting a measure on the ballot and asking their voters to make a decision, it's really incumbent upon that agency to inform voters about the decision you're asking them to make. That doesn't mean using public dollars to advocate up or down on a measure. That's not what this is about, but it's really just giving voters the basic information they need to, on their own, come to a well-informed decision. Next slide, please. So in terms of the methodology, or how we went about doing this study, when you're doing revenue measure research, the first question you need to sort of think about is, who's ultimately going to be deciding the fate of this measure if you were to move forward. And in this case, and you want to make sure that you have a representative sample of those individuals. So if we're thinking about a potential November 2024 measure, what we did is we used a process called stratified and clustered random sampling to select a sample of voters from the likely voter file within the city of Arroyo Grande. That is, in fact, representative of that larger universe of November 2024 voters on all the dimensions that we know are related to voting behavior. And so by controlling for things like age and gender, partisanship, household party type, as well as subgeographies within the city. When we're structuring our sample, we ensure that at the end of this process, we have a sample that is in fact representative of that November 2024 universe. Once we'd selected our sample, we reached out using 3 different methods: email, text, and telephone. Everything's PIN protected so that only those individuals who were randomly selected and whom we invited to take the survey could access the site. They could take it one time only. And they were given the option of either taking it online, if that was their preference, or by telephone. We had set out to do 400 interviews. We actually got a better sort of response and productivity rate from the survey than we had anticipated. And so we walked back in the door with 487 completed interviews, which is great. What that does is gives us an overall margin of error of about plus or minus 4.4% at the 95% confidence level. What that means is we can be 95% confident that the results we'll be talking about tonight are within 4.4% of what we would have found had we spoken with all of your likely November voters. Okay, on to the results. So we like to open up these surveys with some warm-up questions that kind of just get people thinking about their community and getting them into the groove of taking the survey. The first question we asked here was simply how they'd rate the overall quality of life in Arroyo Grande. Would they say it's excellent, good, fair, poor, or very poor? Overall, as you can see here, we had nearly 9 out of 10, 89% of respondents rate the overall quality of life in the community as excellent or good. You had about 8% who said fair, about 2% who said poor or very poor. Obviously, this is a good sort of overall rating for the community. We don't often see it where 9 out of 10 are rating the quality of life in the community as excellent or good. It's also kind of instructive because what we tend to find is that voters who care about the community they're in, who have a high opinion of the quality of life of the community they're in, those voters also tend to be more likely to support local revenue measures that are designed to really maintain and or enhance that quality of life. Next slide, please. So after that opening question, we asked folks to tell us if the city government could change one thing to make Arroyo Grande a better place to live now and in the future, what change would you like to see? This was an open-ended question, meaning that we didn't provide respondents with the list of options you see there on the slide. We simply allowed them to tell us in their own words what change they'd like to see. We went back and reviewed those verbatim responses and then grouped them into the categories that you see here. And probably the most striking thing to me, given that I get to do this for a lot of cities around the state, is that 2 of the top 3 responses are either not sure, can't think of anything, or no changes are needed, everything is fine. And if you combine those 2 categories together, you have 1 out of every 4 respondents, you know, when you kind of hand them a soapbox and say, stand up on that soapbox and tell us one thing we can do to improve the community, they either shrug their shoulders like nothing really comes to mind, or specifically say there's no changes that are needed. So that's a great response. That's a good indicator of a well-run city. Among the specific changes that were requested, you can see about 16% referenced city infrastructure in some respect, or roads. You had about 8% who mentioned homeless issues, another 6% who mentioned reducing traffic congestion, about 5% mentioning that they wanted to have more sidewalks in the community, et cetera. So it gives you an idea of sort of what's top of mind for your local voters when given the opportunity to suggest, you know, one change to the city. Next slide, please. And then rounding out those warm-up questions, we asked individuals, generally speaking, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the job the city of Arroyo Grande is doing to provide city services? Because this question is asked about the city's performance in general, right? We're not referencing a specific area like fire or police or streets and roads. We're asking them to comment on the city's performance in general. It can be considered sort of an overall performance rating for the city. Overall, we had 85% of the respondents we speak to say that they were satisfied with the city's performance. That's a really solid score. I can tell you, again, I do this for a lot of cities and I've done it for over 2 decades. And the very top performing cities on, you know, when they get a really top score, you're looking 90, 91%. So it's low 90s. That's kind of the upper level that you can hit. And I have seen these scores in the 40s multiple times. So to have 81% overall satisfied is a really good score overall. Okay, so next slide. So after those warm-up questions, we kind of get down to business with what we call the initial ballot test. And the idea here is before we get any deeper into the interview and we start talking in more detail about how the funds from a particular sales tax measure might be spent, or conveying arguments on behalf of this measure or arguments opposed to this measure, we want to present to respondents a mock-up of what we think that 75-word ballot statement could look like and get their reaction. It's a really good gauge of where the community is at on the natural with respect to this proposal, because we haven't provided them with any of the additional details that are going to come later in the survey. And so shown here is the ballot language that we tested. It's in the form of a general sales tax with the rate set at 1 cent for a duration of 10 years. So that's the language we tested. And on the next slide, you'll see the results. So overall, at the initial ballot test, we had 65% of respondents say that they would support this proposal. You had 29% who were opposed, and you had about 6% who were unsure. So in the state of California, for a general tax measure, you need a simple majority or 50% plus one to be successful. So at this initial ballot test, we're sitting about 15 points north of that simple majority. Obviously, that's a great place to start. Not shown on the slide, but if you dig behind the overall results and you start looking at it by various subgroups of voters based on age, based on partisanship, based on how long they've been registered to vote in the district, et cetera, what you find is that support for this proposal is really widespread. Out of 30 plus subgroups, there's only a couple that don't support this at a majority, and they're typically in the high 40s. And so that's great. Even some of the groups that we tend to find are the most tax adverse, and often the supporting at the initial ballot test for other types of measures in the sort of low 30s, we had support at majority for those groups. And so kind of a widespread appeal for this proposal. Next slide, please. So after the initial ballot test, we get into the projects and services section, and the idea here is really twofold. The first thing is that we are now going to start to educate this respondent a bit more about what your measure will accomplish. In that initial ballot test, we only had 75 words to describe the measure, and only about half of them can be devoted to describing projects or services that can be funded. Here, we get to unpack your proposal into all the different types of services and projects that could be funded to give them an idea of what this measure could be about. It's also an opportunity for us to understand, of all the ways you can spend the money, how do they feel about those various ways, and ultimately which of these rise to the top of the list in terms of their priorities. And as you can see here on this list, everything that was tested got a good reception from respondents. At for even the lowest rated item there had 70% of respondents say they would favor spending some of the money of the measure on that item. When you look at the top, though, there's kind of a tier that happens there about a little below midway up. And everything above that tier is one of two things. It's either a public works project or it's a public safety project, right? And that is also very typical of what we find of these measures that, at the end of the day, push come to shove, voters are asked to prioritize, how city revenues would be spent. They often gravitate towards public safety and public works. So next slide, please. So, if the city council chooses to place a measure on the November ballot, there's going to be an election cycle, right? And during that election cycle, there's going to be a lot of discussion and debate in the community about your proposal. You'll have some folks who undoubtedly step up and advocate on behalf of this measure, trying to convince their neighbors and friends that, this is needed and they should vote yes. You might have some opponents as well. People step up and say, this is a bad idea, we shouldn't be doing this, and here's why. For this to be a reliable gauge of the feasibility of your sales tax measure, we need to simulate that discussion and debate in the space of the poll, so we know not only where your voters on the natural, which was that initial ballot test, but what happens to their support once they're exposed to the types of positive arguments and negative arguments that they're likely to encounter during the election cycle. So we do that by testing positive and negative arguments in the space of the poll. On this slide, you see the positive arguments we tested. The nature of the question is, supporters of a measure say blank, you insert a positive argument. And do you think this is a very convincing, somewhat convincing, or not at all convincing reason to support the measure? You can see here on this slide that there's a lot of arguments that get traction, right? That have 60+% of respondents say that it's at least a somewhat convincing reason to support the measure. When you get to the very top of the list, though, it's interesting. One of the things we've been finding this cycle is that if you can be a little specific in your messaging, it often turns what would otherwise be a kind of ho-hum argument into a strong argument. So the very top one there is that the city maintains 73 miles of streets in Arroyo Grande, and that the funding raised by this measure will allow the city to fix potholes and keep up with basic repairs and maintenance to streets, sidewalks, underground storm drains, pipes, and public facilities. You know, in a small community like yours, it's probably a shock to some residents that, you know, you actually have 73 miles of streets that you have to maintain in your community. And what we're finding is that if you can just add a little bit of detail to that messaging, it tends to, you know, give it a lot more traction. So now at this point in the survey, voters have heard a lot more about your proposal than they did initially, right? After the initial ballot test, we got to elaborate on the types of projects and services that can be funded. We have conveyed positive arguments on behalf of the measure. And so we circle back to what we call our interim ballot test, which is shown on the next slide, where we present that same 75-word ballot statement. We say, now that you've heard a bit more, where do you stand? This is typically the high water mark in support for a proposal in the space of a survey like this, because they've heard how the money can be spent and they've heard the positive arguments, but we have yet to convey the negative arguments. So as you can see here, at this point in the poll, support ticks up. We're now sitting at 68% support. That's about 3 points higher than it was at the initial ballot test. And we're sitting about 18 points above that simple majority that's required for passage of a general tax in California. And then we get to the negatives. That's the next slide. And the idea behind the negatives is I want to pressure test respondent support for your proposal. I want to pepper them with a series of arguments that an opponent might level against your measure during an election cycle to get an understanding of how resilient is voter support for your measure, right? To what, you know, are they the kind of voter who feels strongly about this measure and that even in the face of opposition arguments, they're going to stay put on the yes side, or are they kind of soft yeses, and the moment they hear a few reasons as to why they might want to vote no, they switch over to an unsure or a no vote? And so shown on the slide are the negative arguments we tested. You can see some of them get traction. You can also see, if you read the arguments, we did not pull any punches. We were trying to inflict maximum damage by kind of coming at this measure from all different angles and trying to give respondents reasons to vote no. And so those are the arguments we tested. Now, the next slide is what happened afterwards. So after the negatives, you can see that support for the measure cools down. We drop about 8 points from where we were at the interim ballot test at 68% to land at 60% support at that final ballot test. So although we drop, as you would expect, we still land at 60%, which is 10 points above the simple majority that's required for passage of a general tax. Next slide, please. So at each of the ballot tests and throughout the survey to this point, we've been talking about a measure that would be set at a 1 cent rate. After the final ballot test, if somebody was a no or a not sure at that point, we asked them about their level of support if the rate were lowered to a half cent. And so you can see the white slice of that pie is essentially the 60% support we had at the final ballot test for a 1 cent rate. And the green slices there are the voters who, if they were to drop the rate from 1 cent to a half cent, jump onto the yes side of the equation. And what's striking about this, and pretty consistent with what we see for sales tax measures around the state, is that although you do pick up some support here, almost all of it is what I would call soft support, that probably yes. You have less than 1% who went from a no or a not sure to a definitely yes in dropping to a half cent rate. This is just consistent with the research we've seen all around the state over the years, that when it comes to sales tax measures, voters tend not to be really rate sensitive, right? That the levels of support you see for a 1 cent measure are pretty similar to the levels of support you're going to see for a half cent measure. That's not the same for other types of measures, like a utility user tax, for example. Voters tend to be highly rate sensitive when it comes to those. Same with parcel taxes. But for sales taxes, when you're talking about a 1 cent versus a half cent, you just don't see a lot of movement. Okay, next slide, please. So a couple wrap-up slides. So what does all this mean? I'm going to circle back first to that overarching question I mentioned at the outset as one of the main motivators for why you do this type of research, which is to understand the answer to the question of, is it feasible? Meaning, again, if you as a council were to choose to place a sales tax measure on the November 2024 ballot, does it have a reasonable chance of success? The answer to that question is clearly yes, based on these poll numbers. All the things that we want to see in place for a measure to have a reasonable chance of success, we see in place in this poll and are listed here under the positive signs. We saw that voters really value the quality of life in Arroyo Grande. They value the services they receive from the city, but they also see some room for improvement. Those sentiments translated into strong natural support for the 1 cent measure to fund city services. At that initial ballot test right out of the gates, we had 65% support. That's 15 points north of that simple majority you need. All the projects and services that we tested as possible uses of the funds were popular. Those positive arguments resonated. And importantly, at each point in the survey where we circled back to a respondent and said, now that you've heard a bit more, where do you stand on this measure? All of those ballot tests were well above the simple majority required for passage. And that was even after we tested opposition arguments. So collectively, when we see that kind of pattern, it tells us, yes, if you were to choose to move forward, you've got a path towards a winnable measure. You certainly have one that has a reasonable chance of success. Now, we also, looking at the polling and thinking a little bit about what a November 2024 election is going to look like, there are some challenges that we need to kind of pay attention to. One of which is, your voters were pretty receptive to the potential opposition arguments. We saw that between the interim ballot test and the final ballot test, that support dropped 8 points in response to opposition. And so, even though you landed still 10 points above the simple majority, some voters are receptive to those opposition arguments. So you sort of need to factor that into your thinking when you're considering putting a measure forward. The other thing that's sort of outside the poll, but also important to think about, is what the electoral climate is likely to look like in 2024. And if we think the last few elections have been partisan, this is going to be even more partisan. And so, that hyper-partisanship tends to have an impact on some voters that, they will tend to gravitate towards their respective corners as the election cycle proceeds. And so that's a bit of a challenge, right? One of the things that was sort of stood out about your measure this cycle was that it had broad appeal. And even Republicans who are naturally somewhat tax adverse saw the merits of this proposal. And so, as you move forward into that election cycle, the hyperpartisanship is something that will tend to want to pull a few of those voters away. And so that can be a bit of a challenge. And obviously, there's going to be some statewide measures on the ballot this cycle that are kind of going to create their own weather system. You have got ACA 1, ACA 13, and the BRT measure all, which is going to be this kind of big battle over, two measures trying to make it easier to pass taxes, one measure trying to make it harder. And there's just going to be a big discussion about taxes. And so those are challenges that mean, anytime you're thinking about placing a measure on the ballot, you want to think a little bit about what that environment's going to look like. And is it going to be blue skies and tailwinds all the way there? Or is it going to be a bit of a bumpy ride? And I think 2024 is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride. And so we just want to make sure we're prepared for that. And then finally, there are some unknowns, right? We don't, right now, the trajectory of the economy has been good. Inflation's been coming down, but we don't know what's going to happen between now and next November. And so we want to, be able to withstand some of those fluctuations if we should get some downturns in the economy and or an uptick in inflation. And we also don't know what other local measures may be on the ballot. The one thing you can probably guess is you're not going to be alone, right? There's going to be some other measures that may overlap with your measure. And so factoring that into your thinking as well in terms of the type of measure you put in front of your voters is important. So next slide, please. So the final slide. So summing all that up, the one thing I want to kind of emphasize is as promising as these results are, and they are very good results in terms of looking at the feasibility of a measure. A poll like this is a snapshot in time. It is not a crystal ball, right? It's not looking forward to election day saying you're going to get 65% on election day. It's telling you where your voters are today, as well as how they react to information, the kind of information they're likely to encounter during the election cycle. But ultimately, what happens on election day isn't dictated by what your poll says today. It's dictated by all the decisions and things that happen from this point forward. And so I say that mainly because it's kind of a healthy reminder that, we need to be making smart decisions about how you structure this measure so that's well aligned with the type of measure that your community is interested in supporting. And ultimately, you got to put the work in terms of communicating with voters about this proposal as you move forward. And so that's really what this last slide is about. In terms of smart decisions, although it's a general tax and you cannot earmark the funds specifically for any project or service, nevertheless, you can talk about how you would intend to use the funds and the types of projects and services that do receive funding from your general fund. And in terms of the priorities from your voters, as we talked about, they really emphasize public works as well as public safety. In terms of putting the work in, this is a really helpful and important point in this conversation with the community about a potential measure. We're really at the beginning of that conversation. We're not at the end, right? Now that we've learned some things about your voters, and what they would, how they view a measure like this and what their priorities are, it's really time to start continuing that conversation moving forward. And then finally, if council chooses to place a measure on the ballot, ultimately there would need to be an independent campaign, right? Not public funds, private funds, volunteer-led, that is going to kind of help shepherd this measure through the election cycle. So with that, that's the end of my presentation of my slides, but I welcome questions from council if there are any.
Thank you so much. So let's check in with council and see what questions there are there. So Councilmember Burnage, do you have any questions? All right. Councilmember Sechrist, any questions? Councilmember George?
No questions.
All right. Mayor Pro Tem?
So the ballot language certainly implies that you're talking about having a 10-year sunset. And I just wanted to verify that that is in fact what you're presenting to them as the choice that they were being surveyed on.
Yes, it's stated 10 years. Obviously, you can set that at a number of different levels, anything from a few years to 30 years to, you do see some what we call no sunset measures around the state. Given that this is a new measure for you, you're establishing a measure, you're not renewing a measure, my recommendation would be to have a sunset on it. We tend to find that, although we've certainly passed measures without sunsets, it can be a little bit of a risky proposition if you don't have a sunset on your measure. And so better to sort of establish, say, 10-year timeline and show the community how you use the funds during that period. And then when you go to renew this measure in the future, if that's what the council decides to do, that's a better time to think about. Now that we've sort of proven ourselves to the community and have that track record, now we can pull the sunset.
And then you had, I think it was 23% of the surveyed people said that they were totally satisfied with things the way they were, and I think we had, just a little bit more than that of people who would have voted no or would probably vote no or definitely vote no. Were you able to tell, is there an overlap in those two groups? In other words, is the opposition just people who say, I have a warm coat, why would I buy a new one?
No, it's interesting. I could see how that would make sense, right? That I'm totally satisfied, so we don't need this. In reality, those tend to be two different groups, right? What we tend to find is the more satisfied somebody is with the quality of life in their community and or a city's performance, the more likely they are to support a revenue measure to either continue that performance or protect the quality of life in their community. Typically, the people who would vote no on a measure like this, it isn't because they're totally satisfied, right? It's because of other issues.
And I don't have it in front of me. I'm going to say probably similar survey results 2 years ago when we did this, and we were unsuccessful. I don't know if you have thoughts about what might be different this time around, or maybe what we would be doing differently than we did last time.
So you polled so we did a poll for you back in 2019. And at that time, looking at a potential measure, support levels were about 6 to 7% lower than they are today. So the poll numbers were not this good. This poll here ranges between 60 and 68% support. the poll last time ranged between 55 and 59% support.
Okay.
So lower support there. A couple of things. Number one, I mentioned pre-pandemic. I mean, we've all gone through the looking glass in the last few years with the pandemic. And so it's really hard to compare what was happening in the mindset before that to where people are today. And so that's something to consider. You have, as a city, have actually had a pretty pronounced partisan shift over the last 5 years. When we were looking at a measure back in 2019, your partisanship split was Republicans were at 39%, Democrats were at 35%. When you look at that today, Republicans are now at 32% and Democrats are up at 38%. So that has shifted in a way that also can shape polling numbers like this on a measure, because the balance of partisanship is different. And obviously, there's a pretty pronounced relationship between partisanship and support for tax measures. And then lastly, the one thing I will comment on is I took a look at this earlier today. What we tested in terms of the survey and the ballot language wasn't really mimicked on the actual ballot, right? So normally when we do this, and this is an, I think, important thing for this effort moving forward, is we want to test in the poll language that, we'd like to be able to map to the 75-word ballot statement that goes on the ballot. And when I was looking at the ballot statement from 2022, it's very different than what was actually tested in the survey itself. And so that could create a disconnect there as well.
And so when we did in 2019, did we also test a ballot measure with a language with a sunset in it? Because I don't remember that.
That I don't recall. I'd have to go back and look.
Okay.
And here's the thing about that, just to be frank, the language that typically appears when you do not have a sunset in a measure like this is it's until ended by voters, right? Or in some cases, I want to say yours said something like until ended by, I don't know if it was voters or council. So it was kind of a different wording, a slightly different wording than what is normally said. That kind of language in the space of a poll actually tests pretty well. The issue, though, is when you get into an actual campaign, if you do not have a sunset on this measure, sometimes that invites a lot of opposition, right? People will key in on that issue and will decide, it's not that I don't think that this measure is needed, but voters should be able to come back and review this every 10 years or so. It shouldn't be forever.
And then finally, do you have any thoughts on, a lot of people use a citizen committee as a review committee, or we use a report every year. And I'm wondering if you have that. I didn't see that as part of the survey. I don't know, that may be more detailed than start to lose track of things there, but your thoughts on whether that's a useful part of the measure or not.
Yeah, we actually, in the 75-word ballot statement we tested, we did have with citizen oversight. And so the idea is you'd have an appointed citizen oversight committee that would just be a second set of eyes in terms of looking at how the funds are spent. Are they consistent with, the stated purpose of the measure? And so that was built in there. You do have some voters, obviously, who they kind of like to see that you have accountability provisions built into a measure like this, that, there's sort of multiple checks and balances, so to speak, to make sure that, okay, if we're going to vote yes on this, I know that money ultimately is going to be spent in a way that's consistent with the stated purpose of the measure.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
So do I. Is it okay if I go, or you want to? Okay. I got a couple questions, but my questions are for staff. So if your question is for the consultant, Kristen, go ahead.
I think it is. Can you I think I'm understanding what you said is it's important if you do put something on the ballot, I think you said to use the same ballot language or use the same phrasing that you used in your survey. But then I said I heard that when you did the survey last time, we didn't use the same ballot language. Is that correct, that was in the survey?
Correct. That if you look at the wording that was tested in the survey in 2019, ultimately the idea in 2019 was looking at a 2020 election. And there's one other thing I would say that's a little different there. So the council chose not to move in 2020, and then I think the decision was later, subsequent, pandemic hit. In 2022, a measure was put on the ballot. That measure's ballot language, if you read it and then you read what was tested in the survey, they're pretty different. And so differences in the ballot language itself can create differences in what the outcome is. One other thing I forgot to mention when I was asked about what the difference was, the other thing is when we were doing surveying in 2019 for a potential 2020 measure, that is another presidential general election, right? That is a high turnout election like what we're going to see this coming November 2024. The measure didn't actually go on a presidential general, the cities. You chose to put it on the gubernatorial in 2022. The turnout in that election's quite a bit smaller than a presidential general. And generally what happens as you shrink turnout, you tend to get an older, more conservative, more likely to be a homeowner, a bit more tax adverse electorate is what happens. And so the actual sort of balance of people making the decision will be different in a gubernatorial election than it is in a presidential general.
Okay, and then, you can, if you don't have the answer to this right here, are you able or is someone able to refresh my memory on what the language was when we did put it on the ballot?
I don't have it here.
Tim, I have it pulled up right here, so I can read that.
Thank you, Jessica.
So Measure D22, our ballot question was.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for just a minute? Because it's gonna connect to my question. Can you put the tested question up while you read the old question? I don't remember what slide number it is, but could you put that up there, please? There we go. Thank you.
Are we okay with this? Okay. Okay, so this was Measure D22's question. It was to provide funding for general governmental use in Arroyo Grande, including maintenance and repair of streets, sidewalks, stormwater, and drainage facilities, and for other city programs and facilities, shall an ordinance establishing a 1% sales tax be adopted, providing approximately $5.6 million annually until ended by the city council, and requiring annual reports on revenues and expenditures and review and public hearing by the city council every 5 years on its necessity.
Okay, thank you.
So picking up the ball from there, Isaac, I was going to have you take a look at this, and I wish I would have thought to ask this question before tonight. What is your opinion about that wording in terms of it surviving a potential test from the California Business Roundtable?
Well,
should it be successful?
I couldn't speak on that tonight in specifics, but we would have to vet the language that was tested just to ensure it was consistent with FPPC regulations and state law. So I think...
So that was not done prior to this?
Correct. Our office did not review the survey results in advance. However, I think, the crux of what the ballot measure says is certainly something that fits in line with those regulations. But if council provides direction tonight to proceed, then at that time our office would work with the city and work with the city's election consultants on the specific language, which would come back to the council to review the specific text.
Thank you. And to staff, and I don't know to whom, so I'll just point at Mr. Downing. Mr. Downing, have we identified a independent community group already that would be willing to carry this should the council make a decision?
So I do not have an answer to that question as of yet, so I will turn it over to Mr. Robeson.
Thank you. We have identified some potential community group leaders. We would need to get direction from your council after tonight. Then we would pursue that and confirm their involvement and desire to move forward.
When you say community leaders, does that mean people who would be willing to conduct a campaign, or are you just talking about community leaders that are willing to support publicly?
I think it's both. So we have community leaders that we've talked to over the past weeks that are both in support and not in support at this point, or giving us information about concerns that they have, that they've heard in the community. And then we also have spoken to a couple of people that are interested in the campaign portion of that community advisory group.
All right, thank you. Are there any other follow-ups from council for Mel? All right, then let's go ahead and open up public comment. Would anyone like to comment on this item? And seeing no one live or in chambers, let's check in with the city clerk.
If any members of the public on Zoom would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. There are no raised hands.
All right, then we'll close public comment. We'll bring this back to the council for comments and consideration. Councilmember Seacrest, do you have any comments to make?
Thank you. So I would say it's been never having been involved in something like this, it's been fascinating to see what went into True North's efforts here. It seems thorough and well done is the best I can say. So I would be interested in moving forward, but is that our...
Well, we'll hear from the rest of the council.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, Councilmember George, comments?
Thank you. I found that those results a little fascinating. It was. I'm interested in that our 2022 wording was much more specific in that it spoke to infrastructure repair, and the survey question was a lot more general. And I think that it's counterintuitive to me, because I would think that as a voter, knowing specifically where the money would be spent would gain more traction than just general funds, which anyways, I just, in the 2022 election, when we were discussing this measure, or the previous measure, a lot of the concerns were that the money wasn't going to be spent where we said we were going to spend it, which was part of the presentation tonight. So I'm happy that was touched on. It's just interesting that the wording was so generic that I guess that wouldn't really matter in this case. I could be wrong. I'm definitely interested in moving forward with the consultant and possible measure. I think that the numbers are promising, and I would hope that an additional $6 million might be something that our public would be interested in supporting. Thank you.
Councilmember Burnich.
Thank you. I'm definitely in support of moving forward with staff and the consultant. And I'm just really excited that we got such a nice report card from the community, even though it was just a slice of just the quality of life. I felt like that a lot of them thought that it was good or excellent. So it's kind of nice and reflects certainly on staff and what we're doing to provide some of that. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, Mayor Pro Tem.
So just real quickly in a comment, I think the language is very close match to the previous sales tax, which I think was 2006 language, with the 5-year rule, the 5-year review by council, and the reporting. I think that may be why it was written that way, so that the two would match up, which brings me to a comment. If I'm being too specific, just is that it might be a good idea to go that in this measure that we combine the two together and take the opportunity to maybe change the report so that they match up, but maybe make them match up differently. So now the half-cent sales tax from 2006, the local sales tax, would be combined with this as far as reporting and as far as review by a committee goes. And assuming we can do that. And the second thing that I would recommend is that we move that report, because you've heard this from me before, from July to January when we actually have some results. Unaudited results, but results. But so I just wanted to get that in there. I too am in favor of moving forward. I will say one thing under education, I was, during the last election, I was knocking on a lot of doors. I sort of had a premonition in advance that this probably would not pass based on a couple of things. One was there was this sense, I think it was because of a lot of the issues that were going on at the state, that the money wouldn't be spent as advertised, and we were advertised very specifically. But the second thing is I think people didn't realize, you have lots of money, but they didn't realize how expensive it is to fix roads and to do some of these things, and how much more expensive it was than it was 20 years ago. And I think that's part of the education process as well. But I'm definitely in favor of moving forward with the next step here and taking a look at doing this in the future.
So I'll start by saying I'm willing to go to the next step, but I was not as heartened by these numbers as the rest of the council was. And so I want to just kind of say where I was at here, which is not to say I'm not willing to hear more, but the methodology had us basically pre-test language, then add positive, then add negative, and watch what happened to those numbers. And the negative caused an 8% drop. But that was after it had been primed by a positive. So if we took that positive out, then you would say we would drop from 65% to -8, which would put it at 57. And that's, my concern is that -8 is low because it got primed by positive first. And where I'm going with this is, if we don't have a citizen group that is robust and ready to do an actual campaign, I'm not willing to spend money to do this, because we're gonna fail. Because the numbers become 65 goes to 57, plus or minus 4, let's take the -4, that puts us at 52. And that's without the buffer of the positive going before the negative. And so I don't think this is as clear a decision as it's presented here, because we saw what happened last time when we didn't do much, and we can't as a city do much to make an argument. If there's nobody to make an argument for us, these numbers are too close. It's not as clear as it looks at 65. So I'm gonna vote to go ahead and allow staff to go to the next step. I wanna see that we can get to language that is similar to what we tested, because if we can't, then these aren't reliable. And again, I'm not willing to go forward and spend the money to do this. So what I'm hoping for as we move forward is that this language is vetted and that we can get as close to the tested language as possible, and that by the time this comes back to the council for a decision to actually move forward, that we have a robust and identified community group that is going to do a campaign. And if not, then I think we're throwing good money after bad. So with that, would someone like to, we need to have a motion to move forward. So would someone like to?
Well, I have a comment or a question, actually. So I would just comment that I think we're way ahead of the game as far as deciding what we're going to do and the public component if we move forward. We are months ahead of where we were last time. There wasn't much lead time. I would also like to see, as far as your perception and what you are talking about as far as the numbers and the positive versus the negative from True North.
Yeah.
See what he says.
That's fine. We can as this moves forward, I think.
I just wanted to hear what he said about, because you bring up a good point, and he does this every day, so I'd like to hear what he has to say just about the positive, what you just explained.
Jessica, is Tim still on?
I am.
He is on and he's ready to answer that question.
All right, Tim.
Okay, so you guys got me still? Audio? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
So there is I hear what you're saying about, well, what if we reversed it and we started out with negatives and what would happen? The reality when these types of measures go out is, and I agree with you, you need to have a campaign, right? There will be a positive campaign. There will be positive messages going out. You sometimes get opposition, you sometimes do not, but you always have the positive. And so that's sort of the logic behind when we start out, we present just the ballot statement. They haven't heard positive or negative yet. And at that initial ballot test, you had 65% support. That's 15 points north of the simple majority. So that's a really good indicator right there that the community, sees the merit of this proposal. We then test the projects and the positives because we know there's going to be positives and we see where they land. That bumps them to 68. Then we test the negatives. So it gives you a sense of where could we land if we don't have opposition? Where might we land if we do have opposition? What we don't test, because it's just not realistic representation of what would transpire during an election cycle, is let's test opposition and let's test no positives, because to your point, Mayor, if there's not going to be some sort of a campaign moving forward, you probably aren't going to make the decision to put it on the ballot in that case.
We did that last time. That was my point. There was no positive messaging last time. Nothing measurable. So that's where my comment came from.
Okay.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Yeah, I'll just make the comment here that I'm more optimistic than that. Primarily, as you say, it was not a great campaign last time. It was, and I was on the campaign in 2016. There was 4 of us there, ran that whole thing in
2006?
2006, I'm sorry. But I think we're starting out so much farther ahead. We only lost by 2 points. We're starting out 5 points ahead of where the testing was in 2019. And in 22, we were dealing with a highly inflationary period, a whole bunch of things going on that were headwinds that, yes, our campaign did not overcome. But it was only, like I say, it was only 2%. What's stunned me that in 2020 was that all the other cities passed theirs, even though we were in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, I thought sure that everything would fail there. That everybody say, no, I want all my money in my pocket I can get. But it was very successful. So just those comments.
I will say, though, this is the bitter person in me from
You don't have a bitter person in there, Mrs.
every
George.
other city that had a tax measure on the ballot in 2022 passed. So 2022.
Oh, 2020.
So even with the inflationary environment that we were all in, our city was the only one that didn't pass it. Goleta passed theirs.
Oh, well, I think about local.
Yeah, locally. I mean, Goleta's pretty local, so they passed theirs. The rest of the local ones were in 2020, but I'm just saying we were the only city that didn't pass. So I don't want to blame it all on the inflationary times because other cities passed, so.
All right.
Can I?
Well, it's probably robust argument. Yes.
So one thing that I've heard again and again is that from people that are interested in this moving forward is that they think it's a very positive talking point to bring up the fact that every other city in this county has passed one. I think a lot of people don't know that. So I hope if there's going to be a robust campaign, of course it includes that, because I think that makes a difference to people.
Madam Mayor, I would move for approval of, let's see, directing staff to continue work with the consultant on a potential future revenue measure.
Second.
All right. Any discussion? We have a motion and a second. Can we get a roll call, please?
Councilmember Barnage?
Yes.
Councilmember George?
Yes.
Councilmember Seacrest?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Guthrie?
Yes.
Mayor Ray Russom?
Yes. All right. Number 13 is council communications. Does anyone have communications this evening?
Well, I would just say that for Mr. Downing's first official meeting, that he's done a fantastic job. I have high hopes. It's only up from here, and
You mean in terms of the minute count, right?
right? And yeah, just happy to have you here, and welcome once again.
This Sunday, hang on, let me make sure it's Sunday. Yes, this Sunday, January 14th, the city will be unveiling a dedication bench to former Planning Commissioner John Keane. And it's going to be at 2 o'clock right here in front of City Council chambers. So if anyone would like to come and be at the unveiling of that bench, that would be great.
I did not have that on my radar. Thank you for that. I have a request to make because I am not going to be at the next meeting, and I had it on my calendar to put this request on the next meeting for council communications. I have had considerable discussion with multiple business owners in the village who are begging for an upgrade to our sandwich board ordinance. And there's a lot of confusion and anger out there. And I talked it over with Bill a while back, and the discussion was that perhaps on the 23rd, I would bring that up under council communications and get direction from, or concurrence from another council member to bring that forward. We will be looking at the sign ordinance presumably as part of the general plan update, but I don't think that the business community wants to wait for clarification and possible modification of that. So I'd like to ask tonight, and forgive me for bouncing that on you tonight, Bill, but a little early, but because I'm not going to be here at the next one, I'd like to make that request. That was very quiet. Did you just say sure? Yeah. Okay, I'll take that. And all right, so if mics weren't on, so we had 2 concurrences. So Bill, do you want me to state that a little bit more clearly, or do you understand the request from council?
I think I understand the request, although we have a signed ordinance that is old and is not totally clear. Then we have the enforcement side of that. And I think the enforcement side is because the ordinance is not clear. So we'll start to make some movement towards maybe a workshop in front of the council and things like that, so that we can start making some headway on progressing to improve that and having a new ordinance.
And I think, and forgive me for skipping over you, Mr. Downing, but this is going backwards to a conversation previous. The dovetail will happen here. But my concern is that the business community is begging for faster movement. And so I guess my intent is to speed up the process by having council asking this.
So I don't know if I'm getting close enough to the microphone or not. So I'm going to assume, and I admit that I haven't looked deeply at our sign ordinance since, through this onboarding process, that we have not made any significant updates in the last 4 years that I have not been here. But I am very familiar with the sign ordinance. I have a lot of memory of previous council discussion on particularly sandwich board signs here in the village. I do believe we can take a look at what the current regs are, bring something to you in with a plan of how we can enforce our current rules, as well as getting some direction on what you want us to do from that point, whether you want us to make changes, and I'll work closely with Mr. Robeson based on his history in this role in the last few months.
And I think, especially considering your onboarding here, that interfacing with the business community itself would probably be a good thing.
Yes.
And one of the things that I continue to hear, besides the pros and cons of sandwich boards themselves, are the actual cost of the signage.
Right.
So just putting that on your radar. Okay. Any other council communications? All right, then that takes us to item 14, adjournment. We'll see you all in 2 weeks, everyone.